You know, if you listen to Republican supporters of voter ID laws, you'd think this is all about integrity.
It's not an unfair burden on people to get an ID to prove that they are who they say they are, and it's a reasonable step that states may take and should take to preserve the integrity of the ballot.
But a new nonpartisan study tells a different story. Researchers from the University of Massachusetts just published a study of all state restrictions on voting over a 5-year period. And the data shows that bills to restrict voting rights were more likely to be introduced in states with larger African-American populations and higher minority turnout in the previous presidential election, and states where both minority and low-income turnout had increased in recent elections. In other words, folks, if you go where poor and black voter turnout is rising, you are likely to find laws that make it harder to vote. And you can see it all in one map from the study. Many of the states which passed the most voter restrictions are in the South. Joining us is Sherilyn Ifill from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and MSNBC's Zach Roth, who's been covering this issue. Some people may say, hey, I think I already knew that. Who cares? Other than the fact that this is a problem. But doesn't the study help deal with one of the premises in this Supreme Court decision in Shelby this year?
Absolutely. You know, the Supreme Court essentially decided the Shelby County voting case and said, you know, the South shouldn't be stigmatized anymore as the place where voter suppression or discrimination happens. You know, the 1960s are over, and now we're in a contemporary situation that doesn't require us to monitor what Southern jurisdictions do as it relates to minority voters. But this study shows us exactly what we already knew intuitively and by anecdote, but now we know through this study that the efforts to suppress minority voters through these new voter suppression laws that it just arose from nowhere, that suddenly we had this concern about the quote-unquote integrity of the ballot, arose precisely in those jurisdictions where officials were attempting essentially to suppress the minority vote, largely because they suspected that these voters would vote Democratic. And this voter suppression of minorities has been, you know, part of kind of the DNA of the South for, you know, more than 100 years.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because the original Voting Rights Act law, which some people feel we can still renew in Congress, said to places that had a bad record, hey, you need a permission slip because you have a bad record. And Zach, you've done some reporting recently that shows that some of these very concerns about integrity actually show that only 17 non-citizens in Ohio out of millions even made it to vote, which was supposed to be the thing they were trying to prevent.
That's right. The Ohio Secretary of State just announced this week 17 non-citizens voting, he found after a very long investigation, out of, I think, 5.6 million votes cast. So I can't do that math that quickly, but that's a tiny percentage. He had previously announced, aside from non-citizens, just the number of voter fraud of illegal voting was in the hundreds. So again, you just have a very infinitesimal percentage. Unfortunately, by holding a press conference and even kind of announcing these figures, the likelihood is Republicans are going to jump on that and say, this is why we need to pass voter ID.
Well, sure, the headline has the word in it, right? In the same way that if you talk about the deficit a lot, people think the deficit's going up, even if the article's about the deficit going down. Sherilyn, take a listen. We spoke to Senator Bernie Sanders yesterday. Take a listen to what he said.
Our Republican friends are too cowardly in many respects to have fair elections. And the only way they're going to win, as they understand it, is to deny lower-income people, people of color, older people from the right to vote by making it harder and harder.
You know, those comments actually speak to precisely why this issue is one all Americans should care about. This is actually not, in many ways, a civil rights issue or a minority voters issue. It's a democracy issue.
Right.
We're essentially operating in a system in which some people, because they fear they won't be able to win, have decided to suppress the vote, the thing that marks us all as citizens, the one thing we all share equally, have decided to try and suppress the vote in order to basically control the outcome. That's something we should all care about. I don't care if you live in Maine or if you live in Wyoming. You should care if essentially you have leaders, elected leaders, who are engaged in the process or at least willing to talk about the desire to suppress the vote.
And that's something the NAACP has argued for a long time.
Legal Defense Fund, yes.
Legal Defense Fund. Are we a country where voters pick the politicians or politicians pick the voters? Thank you both for being with us. We are out of time on this segment, but we're going to keep on it, and we will be